Yo guys, what is up? We're going to kickstart this video with a comparison right off the bat. So you are seeing two photos here. Here is photo A. This photo might have been taken with either the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6 or my $5,000 Sony Alpha professional camera system. Here is the second image in this series. Before I reveal which image was taken by which device, let's talk a little bit briefly about the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6. So briefly, an overview of the camera here. The main camera has been increased to a 48 megapixel sensor. The ultra wide is a standard 12 megapixel sensor along with a 12 megapixel telephoto. This though is an interesting lens because it goes from 3.5x all the way up to 7.1x. That's an 85 millimeter equivalent down to a 170 millimeter equivalent. Hopefully this is making a lot of you guys happy because a lot of you have asked me to cover a Sony Xperia phone because they are a super interesting camera system or smartphone camera system, because I would say they skew more towards the professional end of the market for people that are really trying to take almost like the best smartphone images possible. So of course it's a fantastic test to compare it against a more professional camera system. Without further ado though, let's reveal the results. So image A was actually the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6 and image B was the Sony a7 IV with a Sigma 24-70 f2.8 lens. And before we go any further, I am super excited to compare this camera with the Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra. So if you guys would be interested in watching that video, definitely drop this video a like so I know to kind of get that done as fast as possible for you guys. Okay, so obviously on the Sony a7 IV, I was shooting in RAW. This is the kind of standard way that I shoot with my professional camera setup. So I want to kind of just keep it as similar as possible to how I'd actually use the camera. And the way that I actually shot on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6 is that I also shot, at least initially, in JPEG plus RAW. And the RAWs thoroughly impressed me. So as I've kind of mentioned, there are edited shots here from both the Sony Xperia and the a7 IV. All shots are labeled for this one, but you can kind of see what I mean about being just how impressed I was with the RAW performance on the Sony Xperia. I think when you're shooting in the kind of main 24mm mode, and even the other zoom ranges, but definitely the main 24 is almost like the most impressive for me. The image quality is just genuinely fantastic. I think really the only significant difference is the kind of fall off of the depth of field. So you can see in some images here, I'll highlight one, as you can see here, a particular difference. We have the Sony a7 IV image on the left and then the Xperia image on the right, and you can clearly see the difference just in depth of field. This was roughly an 85 millimeter focal length, but you can see that really basically everything, colors, brightness, evenness of exposure is all pretty much the same. The only real significant difference is just the natural depth of field that you get, and that's basically a sensor size restriction. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the main rear-facing camera lens, that 48 megapixel sensor, even though it is downsampling in the RAW mode, is actually one of the best main rear-facing camera. When you shoot RAW, the image difference is pretty much imperceptible. You obviously do have a difference when it comes to kind of main, just sensor size. The image fall off, the depth of field fall off is just a little bit smaller, but just like look at this image right here. This one was shot on the a7 IV and then this one was shot on the Xperia 1 Mark 6, and it is just genuinely very, very close when it comes to performance. RAW files on this camera phone are genuinely fantastic. Something that's not always fantastic though is the JPEGs, and so far I have to admit I'm a little bit disappointed. So here are a set of images shot on the Xperia, and we've gone through the zoom ranges. So we started on the 1x, then I did the 2x, 3.5x, finishing up with the 7.1x. And I have to say, like I said, I'm a bit disappointed, to be completely honest, when I'm talking about the kind of overall JPEG performance. First of all, just look at this telephoto. You get this quite a lot. You get a ton of variance in the telephoto performance. So like you often end up with blurry shots, especially in lower light situations. A lot of phones struggle with low light zooms, but this does seem to be particularly affected. And even in normal light, you might end up with some pretty bad results. If we throw up the Sony images here, of course, the strongest suit of a camera like this is you're basically able to get perfect images at pretty much any focal length. The quality of the the image looks completely consistent through the frame. You don't get varying performance from the kind of, you know, a wider focal length to a more zoomed in focal length. For our point of comparison, I did want to shoot full 48 megapixel. So that is this here, and I will slowly kind of zoom in here so you can see just how much quality and data is in this full 48 megapixel mode. And this is really nice. You know, the main 1x 48 megapixel sensor are absolutely fantastic. It's more like the other zoom ranges I have a bit of an issue with. Something which is very, very interesting on this phone is the portrait mode version. Even though they don't call it portrait mode, they call it bokeh mode. I'm basically just going to show a whole bunch of Xperia bokeh mode photos and then photos shot on a professional camera. And I've chosen this one to start with quickly because I think this is actually the best bokeh mode photo that I've taken. Unfortunately, after this, things sort of somewhat go downhill. I think the bokeh mode does have a really, really good potential, but I just think when you actually do compare it side by side to a professional camera, you can certainly see which one is better. Like this one here is just absolutely night and day if we do it side by side. I think this image is actually probably one of the closest. What's quite nice is you have bokeh controls, so you can control how much blur is actually in the background of each images. A couple of issues is that it definitely struggles with cutouts sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes, and definitely evenness of exposure. Like sometimes the exposure is just all over the place. You have no manual control in this mode, but for some reason, like it's just things will be overexposed for apparently no reason. This is just one of those instances where things are getting a bit weird for me with this phone. Like for the most part, the Xperia is fantastic, and you occasionally get a bokeh mode shot that is absolutely gorgeous right off the bat. But for every like one that is fantastic, you end up with about 4 that are almost like unusable. It has a habit of kind of overexposing certain things in the frames. I actually think a big takeaway of this is why the Xperia line tends to do extremely badly if we look at things like the MKBHD blind camera test. It's basically because in certain situations, and I would say actually a fair few, quite a lot of situations, the Xperia spits out images when you don't manually control them that just end up looking pretty janky. And it's basically the opposite way that normal smartphone cameras tend to work. If you look at lines like the Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra, the Pixels, even the iPhones, they're basically designed to get you an image that looks fantastic right out of the phone almost every time. And it seems like the Xperia is almost like the opposite of that. This is almost like a professional camera system inside a smartphone. You kind of almost have to shoot pro, shoot manual mode to actually get the best out of it. One thing that's really interesting on this phone is the new macro mode. I will hold my hands up. I haven't had a lot of time to actually test this yet. I'll cover this in a lot of detail when it comes to my photographer's review of this phone, because it is definitely an interesting system. The fact that it has a telephoto macro lens means you can get some really interesting compositions. Again, to be honest, if you compared this like for like against a professional macro lens, I don't actually own a professional macro lens, but they are fantastic, and you end up getting, you know, really beautiful shots. Like for instance, I work with a lot of food photographers that work with macro lenses almost all the time on food shoots, and you just couldn't compare them to a smartphone camera. So now let's move on to video. And I've been really, really excited about shooting video on the Sony Xperia Mark VI. There is an interesting caveat with this though. I think I'm right in saying, and I've kind of done a fair bit of research here, but Sony has been kind of going through a process of simplifying their camera apps. And the new photo camera app is really fantastic on this phone. It gives you a ton of manual control. I really, really like it. It doesn't look like you can actually shoot high quality professional video using this phone right now. We're apparently waiting on a release of something called cinema mode, which is basically going to be a standalone camera app to shoot higher quality video, even though it's not available right now. So basically we're stuck in the default camera app shooting video inside here, and basically you can't really control almost any of the settings manually. So that is really a big issue. I was wanting to kind of lock exposures, and I found even that complicated. So even though I'm not really sure whether this is a very fair comparison right now, I did still want to throw up some footage to at least, so you can at least see the difference between the kind of video that you're getting right now out of the Xperia. So this is the Sony A7 IV. All of these clips are going to be 4K. The ones I've chosen here are either 50 frames a second on the Sony A7 IV because I shoot in PAL, and then 60 frames a second on the Sony Xperia, and then I've slowed them down to 50% speed and 42% speed respectively. massively so they fit in a timeline and don't drop frames, so you can kind of see. So this is almost like the 1X. I know I'm a little bit further away in the shot here, it just wasn't a perfect matchup, but they were both a 1X kind of 24mm focal length. The Sony was manually controlled, so it just exposed a little bit brighter than the Xperia, which you can clearly see it kind of just adapted to the scene. And I actually think the 1X here looks really, really good. So that's almost a nice thing. The performance here is very strong. Things definitely get a little bit more muddy when we move to the telephoto, as you can see here. So this is the Xperia. This is the 170mm zoom on the Xperia, and definitely the detail is far more muddy. Obviously, it was a slightly lower light situation. It's not nighttime by any stretch, but you can clearly see that it is, a little bit of a lower light environment, and telephotos tend to struggle in that type of environment. But if we switch over to the A7 IV here, you can clearly see the difference. That extra sensor size really, really helping just to brighten up the scene. Everything looks sharper, crisper, more fluid. Yeah, there's a big difference here. But like I said, I'm eagerly awaiting the release of that cinema mode. So, I mean, there we have it. Like, this is an interesting video for me, like I've already mentioned. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark VI definitely checks a lot of boxes when it comes to shooting more professional image, more considered images. I, of course, know this is going to be mainly for photography or smartphone photography enthusiasts, so it's definitely not aimed at everyone. I've been blown away by the raw performance. I think they're absolutely fantastic. And this is where things get interesting, because if you were asking me to actually replace my professional camera system, there's a chance I actually might go for the Sony Xperia Mark VI over even, lines like the iPhone 15 Pro, because you just do get a ton of manual control. Certainly when cinema mode comes out, that is going to make things that much more interesting.